On a gray Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Delmar Ostrander stood in a gravel driveway outside a white clapboard farmhouse in Chickasaw County, Iowa, and watched 30 years of a man's life get sold off by the box. The estate sale had started at 7. By 9, the kitchen tables were bare, the tool chests had been picked over, and a small crowd of dealers and collectors and curious neighbors had worked their way through the garage and into the barn. Delmar had arrived at 6:30, before the orange extension cords were run and the price tags were written, and he had stood at the edge of the driveway with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and waited. Not because he was impatient, because he knew something the other early arrivals didn't. The man who had lived in this house was named Clarence Huber. He had been a pattern maker. Let me tell you about Clarence Huber, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what was sitting in his barn. Clarence had worked for 41 years at a gray iron foundry outside Nashua, Iowa, a facility that cast pump housings and gear blanks and valve bodies for agricultural and industrial customers across the upper Midwest. He had started there in 1941 as a sweeper and worked his way to the pattern shop by 1944, where a senior pattern maker named Gus Peterson had taken one look at the way Clarence handled a chisel and decided the boy had the hands for it. Clarence spent the next 4 decades learning a trade that most people in 1987 couldn't have defined and fewer still could have practiced. He retired in 1982 and died in the winter of 1986, quietly, in the same house where he had lived since 1953, survived by a daughter in Des Moines who had never fully understood what her father did for a living and who had hired an estate sale company to clear the property by the end of March. Pattern making, for those who don't know, is the art of building the wooden or metal master forms from which sand molds are made in a foundry. When a foundry needs to cast a new part, a pump impeller, a bearing housing, a flywheel, someone first has to build a precise physical model of that part in wood or aluminum or urethane, accounting for the way metal shrinks as it cools, the draft angles that allow the pattern to be pulled cleanly from the sand, the allowances for machining. The pattern is not the part. The pattern is the idea of the part, made physical and precise and transferable. It is the template from which every cast copy descends. Clarence Huber had spent 41 years building those templates, and when he retired, he had brought his patterns home. This was not unusual among pattern makers of his generation. The foundry had kept the production patterns, the ones tied to active customer contracts, but the development pieces, the experimental work, the demonstration patterns Clarence had built to teach apprentices, the personal projects he had undertaken on his own time in the shop after hours. Those were his by quiet understanding, if not by written agreement. He had carried them home in the back of his truck over the course of his last several years at the foundry, and he had stored them in a dedicated room he had built inside his barn, a room with a concrete floor and a dehumidifier running year-round, shelved floor to ceiling with wooden drawers and open racks and hanging forms wrapped in cotton cloth. That room was what Delmar Ostrander had come to see. Let me tell you about Delmar, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. Delmar was 64 years old in the spring of 1987. He had farmed 320 acres in Chickasaw County for 38 years, the same ground his father had broken before him, and he had supplemented his income for most of those years by doing repair work on farm equipment, first for neighbors, then for a wider circle of customers who had heard about his ability to diagnose problems that dealers couldn't find and fix things that the factory said couldn't be fixed. He was not a machinist by training. He was a farmer who had taught himself to think like a machinist, which is a different thing and in some ways a more useful thing, because a machinist knows what the machine is supposed to do, and a farmer knows what the machine has to do, and those are not always the same. What made Delmar different from the other men who repaired equipment in Chickasaw County was that he understood foundry work. His uncle had worked in a gray iron foundry in Waterloo for 22 years, and Delmar had spent 3 summers as a teenager working summers there, not in the foundry itself but in the pattern shop, sweeping and fetching and watching, the same way Clarence Huber had started. He had never become a pattern maker, but he had learned enough to know what a pattern was, what it was worth, and what you could do with one if you had access to a foundry willing to pour a small run. Which meant that when Clarence Huber's estate sale was announced in the Chickasaw County Courier, and the listing mentioned a pattern chest and assorted foundry materials in the barn, Delmar Ostrander was the only person within 50 miles who understood what that sentence meant. He had known Clarence slightly. They had nodded at each other at the co-op, talked briefly twice at the hardware store. Delmar had known what Clarence did for a living and had always meant to ask him about the patterns, and had never gotten around to it, the way you don't get around to things when you assume there is time. Then Clarence was gone, and the estate sale was announced, and Delmar drove out to the farmhouse at 6:30 on a gray Tuesday morning and stood in the gravel driveway and waited. The estate sale company had priced the pattern chest at $150. It was a large chest, built from quarter-sawn white oak, with 14 shallow drawers fitted with hand-cut dovetails, each drawer lined with green felt and fitted with a small brass label holder. The chest was approximately 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall, and 2 feet deep, and it sat on a low wooden base with casters. The estate sale tag described it as a tool chest and noted that it contained assorted wooden pieces. The woman running the sale had assumed it was a carpenter's chest. She had priced it the way you price a carpenter's chest. Delmar paid $150 for it before 9 o'clock. He also paid $60 for 3 wooden crates stacked behind the chest, which contained wrapped pattern pieces too large for the drawers, and $40 for a cardboard box of pattern maker's tools, shrink rules, draft gauges, a set of core boxes, a pattern maker's mallet with a turned lignum vitae head. He loaded everything into the back of his truck with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was handling, and he drove home. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What do you think was in those drawers? The 14 drawers of Clarence Huber's pattern chest contained, in total, 67 individual pattern pieces. Some were simple, round cores, flat plates, small bosses. Some were complex, a multi-part split pattern for a centrifugal pump impeller, a full set of core boxes for a 6-inch gate valve body, a matched pair of patterns for a pair of pillow block bearing housings in 2 sizes. Each piece was made from sugar pine or cherry, or, in a few cases, aluminum, shaped and fitted with the kind of precision that takes decades to develop. Each piece had a number stamped into it in small brass tacks. A few had paper tags with notes in Clarence's handwriting. Alloy, shrink rate, draft angle, customer code. Delmar spent 3 evenings at his kitchen table going through the chest drawer by drawer, cataloging what he found in a spiral notebook. He cross-referenced the numbers against a foundry pattern numbering convention he half remembered from his summers in Waterloo, and he identified by the end of the 3rd evening that he was looking at patterns for approximately 31 distinct cast parts, several of which he recognized immediately as components that were either no longer in production or available only at prices that made repair uneconomical. Let me tell you about one of those parts, because it's the reason this story is still being told. Among the patterns in Clarence Huber's chest was a matched set of 3 pieces for a water pump housing used on a line of stationary gas engines manufactured in the 1930s and 1940s by a company that had been absorbed, renamed, and eventually discontinued by the mid-1960s. The engines themselves had not been discontinued. They had been built in large numbers, sold widely across the upper Midwest for grain handling and irrigation and small-scale power generation, and many of them were still running in 1987, or had been running until the water pump housing cracked, at which point the engine became an expensive anchor, because the pump housing was no longer manufactured, the original company no longer existed, and the only replacement strategy available was to find a used housing from a parts engine, which was becoming increasingly difficult as the supply of parts engines dwindled. Delmar knew this because he had 3 of those engines himself, 2 running and 1 with a cracked pump housing sitting in the corner of his machine shed, and he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to find a replacement casting without success. He recognized the pattern the moment he pulled it from the drawer. He sat at his kitchen table for a long moment with the 3 pattern pieces in his hands, turning them over, checking the draft angles with his fingers, reading Clarence's handwritten note on the paper tag. Then he set them down carefully on the green felt and went to the telephone and called a man named Arvid Lindgren, who ran a small gray iron foundry in a town called Fredericksburg, about 22 miles south of Delmar's farm. Arvid was 71 years old and had operated his foundry since 1959. It was a small operation, 2 cupolas, a sand system, a handful of employees, most of them part-time, but it was a real foundry, capable of producing gray iron castings from a few ounces to several hundred pounds. Arvid had poured small custom runs for local customers for decades, mostly repair parts and replacement components for agricultural equipment. He was not a cheap option, but he was a real option, which was more than most people had. Delmar drove down to Fredericksburg the following Saturday with the pump housing patterns in a wooden box on the passenger seat. He and Arvid spent 2 hours in the foundry office going through the pieces, checking dimensions, discussing the alloy note on Clarence's tag, talking through the gating and riserin that would be needed for a small run. Arvid ran his thumb along the parting line of the main housing pattern and said it was clean work. He said whoever made it knew what he was doing. Delmar told him about Clarence Huber, and Arvid nodded the way men nod when they hear about someone they would have liked to know. They agreed on a run of 12 castings. The cost, including pattern preparation, sand molding, pouring, and rough cleaning, came to $480 for the lot. Delmar wrote the check without hesitation. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with the check. The 12 pump housing castings came back from Fredericksburg 6 weeks later in a wooden crate lined with wood shavings. They were rough, gray iron, straight from the mold, with the gates and risers cut off and the parting line ground down, but not machined. Delmar had arranged for the machining himself at a small job shop in Nashua run by a man named Emil Kowalski, who had a Bridgeport mill and a small lathe and the patience to work from a sample part rather than a drawing. Emil spent 2 days on the first piece, making the cuts carefully, fitting it against Delmar's original cracked housing to check the critical dimensions. The second piece went faster. By the 6th piece, Emil had the process down to about 3 hours per casting. The finished pump housings were not identical to the originals. They were close. The wall thickness varied slightly in places where Clarence's pattern had been built to a general dimension rather than a precise one, and the surface finish on the machined faces was coarser than a factory casting would have been. But they fit. They sealed. They worked. Delmar installed the first one on his own cracked engine and ran it for 6 hours straight to check for leaks. There were none. He installed the second one on an engine belonging to a neighbor named Harlan Backer, who had been trying to find a replacement housing for 3 years and had essentially given up on the engine. Harlan ran his hand along the finished casting and asked where Delmar had gotten it. Delmar told him. Harlan stood there for a moment and then said, quietly, that he'd be damned. Word moved the way word moves in a small county. By the end of that summer, Delmar had sold 9 of the 12 pump housings at $65 each to farmers and collectors and one small engine restorer from Minnesota who had driven down specifically because he had heard, through a network of engine enthusiasts, that someone in Chickasaw County had a source for the housing. The remaining 3 Delmar kept, 2 for his own engines and 1 as a reference piece. The revenue from the 9 housings covered his cost for the entire run, the machining, and the estate sale purchase, with $40 left over. That was not the point. The point was that 9 engines that had been sitting dead were now running. Now let me tell you about the part of this story that gets complicated, because up to this point, it has been a straightforward account of a man who knew what he was looking at and acted on that knowledge. What happens next involves a different kind of knowing. In the fall of 1987, Delmar began working through the rest of the patterns in Clarence's chest more systematically. He had identified 31 distinct parts. Some were for equipment he didn't recognize and couldn't source a market for. Some were for parts that were still available through normal channels and didn't need to be reproduced. But a core of perhaps 8 to 10 patterns represented components that were genuinely difficult or impossible to source. Parts for obsolete equipment that was still in use, still repairable, still worth keeping running if you could get the pieces. He began making inquiries. He called dealers in obsolete farm equipment parts. He called collectors. He called a man at the Iowa State University Extension Service who dealt with vintage machinery. He placed a small classified advertisement in a farm equipment trade publication that described, in deliberately vague terms, a source for cast iron replacement components for certain obsolete agricultural engines and implements. The response was not overwhelming, but it was steady. Over the following 2 years, Delmar arranged 3 more small casting runs with Arvid Lindgren in Fredericksburg, producing replacement parts for a line of obsolete PTO-driven feed grinders, a series of cast iron wheel hubs for a row crop cultivator that had been out of production since 1958, and a set of bearing caps for a type of line shaft bearing widely used in older grain handling installations. Each run was small, 8 to 15 pieces. Each run was expensive per unit. Each run sold out slowly to people who had no other option. Delmar was not getting rich. He was covering his costs and making a modest return on his time, which for a 64-year-old farmer in Chickasaw County was a reasonable definition of success. But what he was really doing, though he wouldn't have described it this way, was maintaining a supply chain for a category of equipment that the commercial parts industry had abandoned. Let me tell you about the man who eventually noticed what Delmar was doing, because that encounter is the center of this story. His name was Rick Thornton. He was 43 years old in 1989 when he first encountered Delmar's operation, and he was the regional sales manager for a large agricultural equipment dealership group that operated 6 locations across northeast Iowa. Rick was a self-made man in the way that sales managers often are. He had started as a lot attendant at 18, worked his way through parts counter and service writing and floor sales, and had built his career on a genuine talent for reading customers and moving iron. He was good at his job. He drove a clean pickup and wore pressed shirts and knew the horsepower ratings and financing terms for every piece of equipment his dealerships carried. Rick had no patience for old iron. This was not a personal failing so much as a professional orientation. His business was built on new equipment, on trade-ins, on service contracts, on the financial logic of replacement rather than repair. When a farmer came in with a piece of equipment that was 10 or 15 years old and needed a major repair, Rick's answer was a trade-in calculation. That was the rational answer in most cases. The problem was that Rick had come to believe it was the only answer. He had heard about Delmar through a customer, a farmer named Glenn Sorensen, who had bought a set of the feed grinder castings and mentioned it at the dealership service counter while waiting for a part. The service writer had passed it along to Rick as a curiosity, the way people pass along things they don't know what to do with. Rick had filed it away. Then, in the spring of 1989, Rick acquired a problem he couldn't solve. A longtime customer of one of his dealerships, a large-scale operation in Floyd County, had a piece of vintage equipment that was central to a specific operation on their farm, a large stationary power unit that drove a grain leg and a series of augers in an old elevator building they used for on-farm storage. The power unit was a substantial piece of machinery, built in the late 1940s, and it had cracked its main bearing carrier. A large, complex gray iron casting that was the structural heart of the unit. Without the bearing carrier, the power unit was scrap. And without the power unit, the elevator building was unusable, which meant a significant disruption to the farm's grain handling operation at a time when they were not in a position to invest in a complete replacement system. Rick had spent 6 weeks trying to find a replacement bearing carrier. He had called every obsolete parts dealer he knew. He had contacted the successor company to the original manufacturer, which existed in name only as a division of a conglomerate and had no part support for equipment that old. He had found one used bearing carrier at a salvage yard in Illinois, but it had a hairline crack that made it unusable. He had gotten a quote from a machine shop in Waterloo for fabricating a replacement from steel plate, and the quote was so high that it made the trade-in calculation look reasonable again, except that the customer didn't want to trade in. The customer wanted the old machine fixed. A colleague mentioned Delmar Ostrander's name. Rick called. The conversation was brief and, from Rick's end, slightly condescending in the way that conversations are when a man who sells new equipment calls a man who repairs old equipment. Rick described the bearing carrier, gave the engine model and approximate vintage, and asked whether Delmar had a pattern for it or knew where one might be found. Delmar said he didn't know offhand, but he would look through the chest and call back. He called back 2 days later. He had found, in the 14th drawer of Clarence Huber's pattern chest, a split pattern and 2 core boxes for a bearing carrier that matched the description Rick had given him. The pattern had a number and a handwritten note from Clarence that read, "In full, FC 250, 1947 vintage, 3.5% C, pour at 2,650. Check wall thickness at boss." Delmar read the note to Rick over the phone. Rick was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how much it would cost to produce a casting. Let me tell you about that conversation, because it tells you something important about both men. Delmar said he would need to take the pattern down to Fredericksburg and have Arvid look at it before he could give a number. He said the part was large and complex, and he wasn't going to guess at the cost. He said it would take a couple of weeks. Rick said he needed it faster than that. Delmar said he understood that, but that's how long it would take to do it right, and if Rick wanted it done wrong, there were other people he could call. There was a pause on Rick's end of the line. Then he said that would be fine. Delmar drove to Fredericksburg the following Saturday with the bearing carrier pattern in the back of his truck wrapped in an old wool blanket. Arvid examined it for a long time, turning the pieces over, checking the core prints, running a finger along the parting line. He said the pattern was in excellent condition. He said it was good work. He said the gating would need to be rebuilt because whoever had originally gated this pattern had done it for a production environment, and a one-off pour would need a different approach. He gave Delmar a number. Delmar called Rick with the number, $320 for the casting plus machining, which Delmar estimated at another $180 to $250, depending on how the dimensions came in. Total cost in the range of $500 to $570, delivered rough machined and ready for final fitting. Rick said that was a lot of money for a used casting. Delmar said it wasn't a used casting. It was a new casting made from a 60-year-old pattern by a foundry that had been operating for 30 years. He said Rick was welcome to find another option if he thought he could do better, and that the offer would stand if he changed his mind. Rick called back the next morning and said to go ahead. The casting came back from Fredericksburg 5 weeks later. It was a large piece, roughly 18 inches across at the widest point, about 12 pounds of gray iron, complex enough that Arvid had needed to make 2 pours before he got a clean one. The first pour had a shrinkage void in the heavy section at the main bearing bore. The second was clean. Arvid had charged for both pours, which pushed the casting cost to $410, and Delmar had called Rick to tell him before proceeding with machining, and Rick had said, with some irritation, to go ahead. Emil Kowalski spent a day and a half on the machining. The finished piece came in within 0.02 of an inch on the bearing bore, which was well within the tolerance range for a bearing fit of that class. Delmar drove it to Floyd County himself, in the same wool blanket it had traveled in before, and met the farm's equipment operator at the elevator building. The installation took 3 hours. The operator, a quiet man named Leonard who had worked on that farm for 22 years, fitted the bearing carrier into the power unit, aligned the shaft, torqued the cap bolts, and ran the unit up to speed. He listened to it for a while. Then he looked at Delmar and said it sounded right. Delmar drove home. Rick Thornton called him 2 days later. He said the customer was satisfied. He said the machine was running. He said, after a pause, that he hadn't thought it was going to work. Delmar said he had known it was going to work. Rick asked how he had known. Delmar said that Clarence Huber had built that pattern to produce a casting that would work, and Arvid Lindgren had poured it the way it was meant to be poured, and Emil Kowalski had machined it to the dimension it was designed for, and the machine it went into had been built to accept exactly that casting. He said the knowledge was all there, in the pattern, in the foundry, in the machine itself. He said the only thing that had been missing was someone willing to put the pieces together. Rick didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked if Delmar had other patterns like this one. Delmar said he had quite a few. Now, let me tell you about what happened over the following years, because the story doesn't end with one bearing carrier. Rick Thornton was not a man who changed his mind easily or completely. He had built his career on a set of assumptions about how agricultural equipment worked, that new was better, that old was a liability, that the rational response to a broken, obsolete machine was replacement. Those assumptions had served him well for 20 years, and he was not going to abandon them because of one casting. But he was a practical man, and the Floyd County job had demonstrated something he could not ignore. There was a category of problem, a specific and real category, where his standard toolkit didn't work, and where a 64-year-old farmer in Chickasaw County with a wooden chest full of old patterns could solve what he could not. Over the next 3 years, he referred 4 more jobs to Delmar, not enthusiastically, not as a matter of policy, but as a last resort, each time when his other options had been exhausted. A cracked impeller housing on a feed mill, a broken gear carrier on an old PTO gearbox, a set of worn bearing pedestals on a line shaft installation in a century-old mill building that a historical society was trying to restore. Each time, Delmar went to the chest, found what he needed or something close to it, drove to Fredericksburg, and came back with a casting that solved the problem. Each time, Rick paid the invoice without complaint, but without enthusiasm. The thing about Rick Thornton was that he understood value, even when he didn't like it. He understood that Delmar was providing something real. He just hadn't yet found a way to fit it into his worldview. That shift, when it came from an unexpected direction. In the spring of 1992, Rick's dealership group acquired a smaller operation in Bremer County, and in the back of the acquired dealership's parts warehouse they found, stacked against the wall, 17 wooden crates of old cast-iron parts, surplus inventory from a line of equipment the dealership had stopped selling in the early 1970s. The crates had been sitting there for 20 years. The inventory manager who had ordered them was long retired. Nobody knew exactly what was in them or whether any of it was worth keeping. Rick's instinct was to scrap them. They were taking up space. They were 20-year-old inventory for equipment nobody sold anymore, and the scrap iron value was at least something. He called Delmar before he called the scrapper. He called Delmar because by 1992, he had learned enough to know that he didn't know what was in those crates, and that Delmar might. Delmar drove to Bremer County the following week and spent most of a day going through the crates. He had his spiral notebook with him, and he wrote down every part number, every casting description, every dimension he could read from the pieces themselves. He cross-referenced against his catalog of Clarence's patterns and against his own accumulated knowledge of what parts were scarce and what equipment was still running in the county. When he was done, he sat down with Rick in the dealership's break room and told him what he had found. 11 of the 17 crates contained parts that were either already available through current channels or for equipment so obsolete that no realistic market existed. Those could be scrapped. The remaining 6 crates contained parts that were genuinely scarce, components for equipment that was still in use, still repairable, for which no current source existed. Delmar gave Rick a conservative estimate of the market value of those 6 crates, based on the prices he had been getting for comparable parts. The number was substantially higher than the scrap value of all 17 crates combined. Rick looked at the number for a while. Then he said quietly that he had almost called the scrapper first. Delmar said he knew. Rick asked what he should do with the 6 crates. Delmar said he could sell them himself, Or he could let Delmar handle the sales on a commission basis, or he could donate them to someone who would use them. Rick thought about it for a while and then said he would sell them himself, but he wanted Delmar to help him identify buyers because he didn't know the market and Delmar did. They worked together on it over the following 6 months. The 6 crates of parts sold out entirely, at prices that surprised Rick and didn't surprise Delmar at all. The revenue was modest in the context of a dealership group Rick's size, but it was real money for inventory that had been written off 2 decades earlier, and, more importantly, it went to farmers and collectors and restorers who needed those parts and had no other source for them. Rick began to understand, in a way he hadn't before, that the market for obsolete parts was not a sentimental market. It was a practical one. The people buying these castings were not hobbyists mostly. They were operators who had working equipment that needed working parts, and who had been unable to get those parts through normal channels. The demand was real. The supply had simply been allowed to disappear. Let me tell you about the conversation that changed things between them, because it happened in a way neither of them planned. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October of 1993. Delmar was at his workbench in the machine shed, fitting a new casting onto the repaired engine he had originally fixed with the first pump housing from Clarence's chest. The engine was now on its second casting, the first having cracked again after 6 years of hard use, and Delmar had gone back to Arvid for a second pour from the same pattern. Rick Thornton pulled into the driveway unannounced, which was unusual. He came into the machine shed and stood watching Delmar work for a while without saying anything. Then he said that he had been thinking about what Delmar had told him, years ago, about the knowledge being in the pattern. Delmar said he remembered. Rick said he thought he had understood it at the time, but he wasn't sure he actually had. He said he had spent 20 years in the equipment business thinking that the knowledge was in the new machine, in the engineering, the design, the current best practice. He said he had thought of old equipment as a deficit, as something that needed to be replaced with something better. He said he was starting to think that was wrong, or at least incomplete. Delmar set down his wrench and looked at him. Rick said that what Clarence Huber had done, building those patterns, maintaining them, bringing them home when he retired, was a form of preservation that nobody had asked him to do, and nobody had paid him to do. He said Clarence had understood that the knowledge embedded in those patterns was real and valuable and fragile, and that if he didn't preserve it, it would simply cease to exist. He said that was not something he had ever thought about a retired Foundry worker doing. Delmar said that Clarence had probably not thought of it that way either. He said Clarence had probably just thought that the patterns were good work and deserved to be kept, the way a craftsman keeps good tools even after he stops using them regularly. He said that was enough of a reason. Rick asked what was going to happen to the patterns when Delmar was done with them. Delmar was quiet for a moment. He was 70 years old by then, and the question was not abstract. He said he had been talking to the Historical Society in Nashua, the same one he had helped with the mill-bearing pedestals. He said they had a collection of agricultural and industrial artifacts and were interested in the patterns as historical objects. He said he was also in contact with a man at Iowa State who was building a reference collection of Foundry patterns for the agricultural history program. He said he hadn't decided yet, but that the patterns would go somewhere, they would be cared for and documented and accessible to people who needed them. Rick said that was good. Delmar said that Clarence Huber had spent 41 years making things that other people needed. He said the least he could do was make sure those things outlasted both of them. Rick stood there for a while. Then he said he was sorry he had been difficult about the costs early on. Delmar said he hadn't been difficult. He said he had been unfamiliar with the work, which was different. Let me tell you about the years that followed because the story has a shape that takes time to see. Delmar continued working with the patterns from Clarence's chest through the mid-1990s. He arranged a total of 9 casting runs with Arvid Lindgren in Fredericksburg before Arvid retired in 1996 and closed the Foundry. By then, Delmar had produced replacement castings for parts in 22 of the 31 patterns in the chest, in quantities ranging from 4 to 18 pieces per run. He had kept meticulous records. The spiral notebooks had multiplied to 7 volumes by 1996, documenting every pattern, every casting run, every customer, every dimension note. When Arvid closed the Foundry, Delmar spent several months finding a replacement source. He eventually located a small foundry in Decorah that was willing to take on small custom runs, run by a younger man named Paul Gustafson who had learned the trade from his father and had the equipment and the patience for the work. Delmar drove to Decorah with his notebooks and spent a day explaining his operation to Paul, who listened carefully and asked good questions and agreed to take on the work. The transition was not seamless. Paul's sand system was different from Arvid's, and the first 2 runs produced castings with surface defects that required additional cleanup. But Paul was methodical and willing to adjust, and by the 3rd run, the quality was consistent. Delmar worked with Paul through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, by which point he was in his late 70s and doing less of the hands-on work himself. He had brought in a younger man to help, a neighbor's son named Caleb Donnelly, who was 24 years old, had grown up watching Delmar work, and had the mechanical instinct and the patience to learn the pattern business from the ground up. Delmar spent 2 years teaching Caleb everything he knew: how to read a pattern, how to communicate with a foundry, how to identify parts, how to find customers, how to keep records. Caleb was not a pattern maker, neither was Delmar, but they were custodians of the work of a pattern maker, which turned out to be enough. Let me tell you about the moment the chest came full circle, because it happened in a way that would have pleased Clarence Huber. In the fall of 2003, Caleb Donnelly was contacted by a man who was restoring a large stationary engine for a working steam and gas show in Bremer County. The engine was a significant piece, a large multi-cylinder unit from the early 1940s, one of perhaps a dozen surviving examples of its type, and it had a cracked water jacket on the number 3 cylinder that made it non-operational. The crack was in a location that made welding repair marginal, and the restorer had been told by 2 experienced engine men that the only real solution was a replacement casting. Caleb went to the chest. In the 3rd drawer, wrapped in cotton cloth and labeled in Clarence Huber's handwriting, was a pattern for a water jacket casting that matched the engine's specifications. Clarence had built it in 1968, apparently as a favor to someone. The tag had a name on it, a first name only, and a note that said, "Made for Harold, never used." Nobody knew who Harold was. Nobody knew why the casting had never been poured. But the pattern was there, clean and precise and intact, 35 years after Clarence had made it. Caleb took it to Paul Gustafson in Decorah. Paul examined it carefully and said it was good work. He said the man who built it had known what he was doing. He said he could pour it. The casting came back 6 weeks later. It was clean. The dimensions were within tolerance. The restorer fitted it to the engine over a weekend, filled the cooling system, and ran the engine for the first time in 11 years. Caleb called Delmar to tell him. Delmar was 80 years old by then and not getting around as well as he had been. He listened to Caleb describe the engine running, the sound of it, the way the restorer had stood there just listening to it for a while before he said anything. Delmar said that was good. He said Clarence would have been glad to know the pattern was used. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Delmar. Delmar Ostrander died in the spring of 2009 at 86 years old, in the same farmhouse where he had lived since 1951. He left the pattern chest and all 7 spiral notebooks to Caleb Donnelly, along with a handwritten letter that described the provenance of each pattern group, the contacts at the Decra Foundry, and the names of the customers who had bought castings over the years and might need more. The letter was 4 pages long, written in a clear hand, and it read less like a will and more like a set of instructions for continuing a job. Caleb continued the job. The pattern chest sits today in a climate-controlled room in Caleb Donnelly's shop in Chickasaw County, on the same low casters it arrived on in 1987. The green, felt in the drawers, has been replaced twice. The brass label holders are polished. The patterns are inspected annually, and any that show signs of checking or warping are stabilized. The 7 spiral notebooks have been supplemented by 3 more, and Caleb has begun the process of digitizing the records, photographing each pattern and entering the dimensions and provenance into a database that will survive him. Rick Thornton retired from the dealership business in 2001. He attended Delmar's funeral and stood at the graveside in a pressed shirt and said nothing for a long time after the service ended. His son works in agricultural equipment financing now in Des Moines and has no particular interest in old iron. That's all right. Not everyone has to. The Fredericksburg Foundry, where Arvid Lindgren worked, is gone now. The building converted to a storage facility, the cupolas removed. Paul Gustafson's foundry in Decorah is still operating, smaller than it was, but still capable of a small custom run if the pattern is good and the customer is patient. 43 of Clarence Huber's 67 patterns have been used to produce castings. The remaining 24 are intact in the chest, waiting. Some of them may never be used. The equipment they were made for may be gone, or the need may never arise, or the right person may simply never come along. But they are there, clean and precise and intact, in their green felt drawers, in their quarter-sawn oak chest, in a room in Chickasaw County where the dehumidifier runs year-round. Clarence Huber built those patterns to produce castings that would work. He built them carefully, and he brought them home when he retired, and he stored them in a room with a concrete floor because he understood, without anyone telling him, that good work deserves to be kept. The estate sale listed the chest at $150. One man knew what was in the drawers. He paid the price, loaded the chest into his truck, and drove home. And for the next 22 years he made sure that the knowledge Clarence had put into those patterns kept doing what it was built to do. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for the right person to open the drawer.